Hello and welcome to the International Euphonium Summit Living History Series. I'm your host, Nicholas Haffter von Heide, and we have our guest cohort member today for his fourth in series, Dr. Joel Collier. Y'all missed out on a lot of really great stuff on the podcast, so go check that out. Links below. Check out Dr. Joel Collier's channel here at the end of this video segment. And welcome back, Dr. Joel Collier.
Yeah, glad to be back.
Outstanding. Wow, we covered a lot of really great info before this. I will say that he did mention we've been sharing about Kong, this premiere of Amazing Works that's going to happen December 3rd, 2023. Really exciting stuff. The teaser to all that is before this on the podcast. So find all the links below at internationaleuphoniumsummit.com/Joel-Collier for more information.
Yep.
Wow. So let's get into it. Dive into your fourth in series here. It's such an honor to have you on. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to do it. We left off. We've got so much more to talk about, so I'm glad to be back.
Absolutely. So let's dive back into your college years at Drexel.
Yeah, I'm trying to think where we left off, really.
Okay,
So
we're talking about your elements of not composing your freshman year, and we had, as I switched to a fresh page during our pre-segment here for the podcast, I happened to flip myself out of, oh, here we go, right to it. Awesome. I love how that works out. We ended up talking about, even before this recorded segment, we talked about Masked Ball, but more so the conch shell and
yes,
Watermelon Man.
yes,
Let's see. Hold on. The spring of your freshman year, you did do a composition for the dance team.
ensemble. Yep.
And let's jump off to that beat right there with the two commissions that you ended up helping write for Drexel's dance team.
Yeah. So I think we talked a bit about the one in particular that was the freshman year. It was a piece called Triptych that we wrote. I co-wrote with my friend Matt Campana, who is also a freshman music industry major with me. And that was an exciting thing where it was the ballet, so they wanted a classical orchestral sounding style, and modern and hip hop all in one piece. So we were combining those styles under one kind of melodic theme. So that was really exciting. And then in the future years, I was able to stay involved writing for the Drexel Dance Ensemble, and the pieces that I did after that were a bit more single styles, and they were never, none of these were ever meant to be performed by live musicians. It was all digital music, which is its own animal, its own thing, where you have to make sure. The hard part about when you're writing things for live musicians and you're using the computer playback is that the computer playback is never going to sound as good as live musicians, but you're writing with the live musicians in your mind. But when you're writing for digital playback, then you have to find ways to make it sound really good, even though live musicians are never going to touch it. So that is quite a challenge and a very detailed process that is far more than just writing the music. It's you're essentially doing the recording yourself digitally through MIDI and samples, and you're mixing and you're mastering and you're using all of the effects. So there's a lot to it for anybody that's trying to create digital music. It's more than just writing the notes. It's you are producing at that point as well.
So what was the mindset going into that? Did you understand all the technicalities. Okay, let me rephrase that. As I'm trying to kind of frame it for those that have never written something like that. What was your mindset going into it, and what were your kind of premonitions or even perspectives walking into that commission and mindset? And then on the reverse, on the flip side, what did it end up being, and how did you grow out of that?
Yeah, well, one of the nice things, and one of the reasons that I think that Matt and I were asked to do that first project, and then I was later asked to do the other, is that that was essentially, in a way, what I was studying at Drexel University. I was studying music industry, specializing, like concentrating in music technology. So from the very first, Monday of my first semester, I was in a what was it called? Computer and Digital Applications in the Music Industry 1. So very long title, but basically that was a class that taught us how to use a program called Logic Pro to do digital music. And then later took C&D Apps 2, which was about Pro Tools. So that was about some digital music, but also about recording. And then later in my university career at Drexel, I took C&D Apps 3 and 4, which were the advanced of Logic Pro and Pro Tools. And so those classes, among several other classes that I was taking, that were designed to teach me how to do these digital music processes. So I wasn't walking into it with a compositional background and no idea what to do with the digital side. Fortunately, I was actively studying the digital side as these commissions were coming into place. And it was my C&D Apps 1 professor that actually got Matt and I connected with the dance ensemble that first year. So he knew that we had the skills to be able to create the music that was being asked of us.
Okay, so post composition on that particular commission, what were the takeaways, and what did you learn through that process?
Yes, I mean, so many things. It's hard to look back now and necessarily say any kind of specifics, but there was definitely some trial and error. There were definitely things where we knew what we wanted it to sound like and had to figure out how to get there. Asking a lot of questions and sometimes just playing with settings until we figured it out. So you do walk away with a better knowledge about very specific issues. But that's something that still happens. If you're paying attention to what you're creating, if you're really trying to create something that is very detailed and nuanced, and you're paying attention to those details, you're constantly going to learn new techniques and new things. Even now, I just 2 weeks ago, I learned a way to change a setting in I use Sibelius music notation software. And just 2 weeks ago, I learned a way to change some of the notation that I was doing because I wasn't happy with the default way that the computer did it. And I had to go onto an online forum and ask. I ended up, the person that gave me the answer is actually one of the actual tech developers for Sibelius itself. But so it was the same kind of thing, this is what I want to do. I've been trying this and it's not working. What do you suggest? So you find these details that you would have never learned by just sitting in a classroom setting because you wouldn't have tried to do that.
Okay, so what was it that you were struggling with? What specific, like, what was it? A mouse click? Was it a keyboard
Yeah,
entry? What?
that's the hard thing. I mean, I'm trying to think now. We're talking 15 years ago.
So
So
like the Sibelius hack.
that I was having.
Yeah.
Oh, that was I wrote a piece that was in E major concert. Not for the whole piece. I would have never done that because bands don't like that. But it passed through E major. And I had a situation where when it automatically transposed, for the B flat instruments, it put them in F sharp major, and then for the E flat for the E flat instruments, it put them in flats. And I was thinking, this looks terrible. So I wanted to find a way to put the B flat instruments in G flat major rather than F sharp major, but there was no default way to do it. I had to go deep into the settings to find an alternate way to do it. Yeah, it took the recommendation of the person who actually is the programmer for Sibelius to understand the workaround and the way to make that happen. So it was a very unusual situation. It wasn't something that's going to come up all the time. But yeah, I knew what I wanted, and the default wasn't giving it to me. So I said, well, I'm not happy with the default. I'm going to find the answer. And it was the same back then too. I knew what I wanted. I wasn't getting it, so I was playing around until I was like, eventually I will get this. Or I would ask a question and say, hey, when I tried to do this, I remember going to my professor saying, you know, we tried to link these segments together in this way, and then we had this issue with timing. And he was like, well, you could try this and you could try this, and if that doesn't work, then maybe you could try this. And we just had to keep trying things until we found out what works. But once you find out what works, you remember it.
Right? Wow, that's really awesome that you were able to. Maybe that'll be on the next update for Sibelius. Is a shortcut to that particular issue. Wow.
Yeah, I did say it would have been so much easier. There was a setting to change it the other way. I could have put the E flat instruments into sharps with one click, but I could not put the B flat instruments into flats without going deep into the settings.
Huh. That's interesting. Okay, so with triptych and learning all these nuances, would you call those? I would certainly call those nuances.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Learning. How did that step into the summer of between your freshman and sophomore years at college?
Yeah. That's a good question. I'm trying to think. That summer would have been 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, those summers all kind of blurred together. So I'm trying to think of where I would have been that summer. I believe that summer I spent working in actually at a summer camp in West Virginia. I worked for a woman named Melinda Ryan, who has since passed, but she was a great connection for me for a number of years. And I got connected with that camp because some friends of mine from my church at the time, they had met when they were staff members at that camp together years before. So when I was looking for where I was going to work that summer, they said, well, have you thought about going to work at this place? And so that summer I was doing a number of different things. I was helping direct the bands. I was accompanying the choir, you know, and a number of different roles that I took on. It was a music specific program. And actually, even that summer, I wrote a solo that has actually now been published. A solo that was published by the Salvation Army called "The Spirit Within." And there was a young euphonium student who she played very well, and she had just a lovely sound. And I asked her, I said, you know, what's one of your favorite church melodies? And she told me, you know, and I was like, great. I didn't tell her why. And I wrote her a solo for her to play for the end of the summer. She did a nice job, and it has since, as I mentioned, since been published. And so, you know, even these things that you can do sometimes in places that you don't expect to be, or you know, can go on and have a life again outside of what you expected it to have.
And the reason why he's kind of tilting his head and giving a nod back to is the conversation we had before this in the podcast segment. And so you'll want to go and hear that, and you can find that link below, as well as at internationaleuphoniumsummit.com/Joel-Collier. Okay, so with that solo and with all that was happening at that West Virginia summer camp, almost sounds like I don't know. To me, it sounds kind of like maybe a residency.
Yeah, so it's interesting though because I was still pretty young at the time. Like I wasn't there in my capacity as a composer or a performer. I mean, sure, I got hired because I had musical skills, and but everybody that on that staff, particularly again with the music program, everybody got hired because they had musical skills. And I was one of the younger ones on the staff. I wasn't there as an expert. Fast forwarding, and we could talk about it maybe later, but years later, I actually did go back to that camp as the expert. And again, the same director brought me back to be a guest, and I was there for, I think, 2.5 weeks later, several years later. But that summer, I was just another person that they had hired just to help with the program. But I just saw some opportunities. Nobody asked me to write anything while I was there. I just saw an opportunity to do it. And I made it. I know that I made a good impression because the next year, once we went into the academic year, 2008 into 2009, the camp director and that music director that had hired me, they brought me back for several events in the Maryland and West Virginia area over that year. And so, I know that I did make a good impression, but I was just hired as any other staff member that summer.
So you went above. Okay, this isn't a very important principle and mindset for those that are listening who are up and coming or want to make their splash but don't know how, don't know where. Those opportunities will present themselves if you when you step out in doing what kind of like we were just talking about the podcast segment before this, is when you know you're doing good and you're in your element, everything will present itself in its due time, and it's up to you to have that awareness about you and take that action, purposeful action forward into seizing the moment, carpe diem.
Yeah.
And taking that advantage, and look where it led Dr. Joel Collier that that following academic year. Two
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. It's I think that there's a phrase I've heard a few times that I really like where it's luck is really where preparation meets opportunity. And I had an opportunity. I was there just within a program that already existed. But I had done the preparation. I had done the work. I knew I had certain abilities that I walked in with that I saw the opportunity to use them. So you could say that I was lucky because that brought me the things that came later. But really, it was when preparation meets opportunity.
I'm sitting here making sure I highlight this in every single way, in the to emphasize that, especially as like I mentioned at the very very beginning, before our first series and segment even started, is I mean we're into your fourth chapter here, fourth chapter, and each has so much value with all our cohorts. And I mean we're going in, and I believe we're now we haven't even covered a full academic year when we started, and that's totally fine because it it adds those cliffhanger moments. And I certainly want to get through Drexel.
Yeah.
And so let's go ahead and dive in through that. What having that call back from Melinda Ryan
Mhm.
and the cohorts at that summer camp, going into Maryland, and I mean sitting in your sophomore year, what was that sophomore year like? I mean, it seems like it was really busy.
It was. So there were a number of things going on. I just kind of took every opportunity, which also again is an encouragement for anybody listening. Take every opportunity. You need to not run yourself ragged, sure, but at the same time, you never know where things will lead. And so if you can do things, do them. Because my sophomore year, I mean, I have all of the course load of being a sophomore at college. So there's all of that, plus being in all of those ensembles at the university. So I was in the concert band and the fusion band and the rock ensemble. And I played in the brass quintet. And I think my sophomore year we had a tuba euphonium quartet that did a little bit of work as well. So I mean, but if that weren't enough, I also played in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra's Bravo Brass, which is that was down in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, and so I did that my freshman and sophomore years of college. But then also my sophomore year is when I went back to playing with Atlantic Brass Band, having taken a year off. I went back to playing with them sophomore year. In addition to that, I was still playing with my Salvation Army Corps band in Philadelphia and the Pendel Brass. And those were all regular things. Pendel Brass wasn't weekly; that was more, once a month. But all of those other things that I mentioned were at least once a week. Some of them were multiple times a week. But they brought some amazing opportunities. And saying yes to one-off opportunities as well. I remember I went and did a weekend trip with the New York staff band where I was there as a sub in the baritone section. And I also played the Philadelphia Boys Choir. Their embassy is on Drexel's campus, and they wanted to partner with Drexel University and use some musicians from the university. So I was hired to play second trombone in the orchestra for the Philadelphia Boys Choir's Christmas concerts. So, opportunity is everywhere. And if you put yourself in places where you can make connections, we're going to see connections in a second, because the one that we just mentioned with Melinda and it was Tim and Cheryl Gillum were the others that brought me down to do these events. From doing those events, I then met actually the parents of the girl that I had written the solo for. The parents were a couple, Chuck and Julie Whiten, and they will be relevant in my story coming up. And it was just I met them by going down to do those events again. And playing in Bravo Brass, the conductor of Bravo Brass was a guy named Paul Bryan. And that is another name that is going to come up again in my future. And so just being in these places and doing a good job and being kind and respectful to people and professional, then as you'll see as my story continues, these things circle back around. And it can lead to even greater opportunity down the road.
So let's dive in.
Yeah.
Okay. So sophomore year, all these ensembles, your core classes. How was it? At what point did your did you let your parents know what was going on during your sophomore year, if you can recollect? And if so, were throughout your segments and series with us, there's that whole line of support. We already know that's there.
Yeah.
But did they ever tell you, wow, that sounds like a whole lot of stuff going on?
In some ways, sure. I actually lived at home for all 4 years of my undergrad, so I commuted. So yes, they were very aware of what what my schedule looked like. And they were involved in some of it too. the two Salvation Army bands that I mentioned, the Philadelphia Citadel Band, but also the Pendel Brass. My whole family, my parents and myself and both of my brothers played in those groups together. So, not only were they aware, they were there with me for those. So yeah, I mean, they obviously wanted to make sure that I wasn't overextending myself. And there were other things I do remember, and I can't remember what year it was, but there was another group that I joined briefly, and I had to withdraw. I basically had to say, I don't have the time to stick with this. And this is the one that, I mean, to be very honest, I kind of did an assessment, and I said, for the amount of time that I'm having to commit, it's a very low return. The musical standard is not very high, and I am having the opportunity to play in groups that have such a high musical standard that this is taking up a lot of my time, and I don't have the time to give, especially for something that's not very musically rewarding. So it's not that, I just committed blindly to all of these things. They did encourage me to say, be protective of your time.
Mm-hmm.
I also forgot, during the same time, I believe it was the spring of my sophomore year. Yeah, it had to have been sometime during my sophomore year that I founded a brass band in Philadelphia, a brass band named Liberty Brass. So, in addition to all of those other things that I was doing, I was beginning, founding and starting a new brass band that I was conducting and selecting repertoire for and programming concerts. And yeah, there's a lot going on.
So with that founding, did you go through all the business steps to make that happen? Or was that just gathering of the performers, the musicians, and doing the musical side of things?
Yeah, for that particular group, we just did the musical side of things. We had, actually, my church at the time was more than willing to host. And so we didn't have to worry about finding a location that was going to ask for insurance and for all those other kinds of things. So we actually never set that one up as a business entity. And that one only survived a few years. But it's okay, because it did do it. It introduced a number of people to brass band. I know that introduced a number of people to brass band that hadn't been otherwise, who are still involved in other brass bands. So it kind of served its purpose. And the Philadelphia area has a number of brass bands now. So the fact that that band went away didn't necessarily mean people lost opportunity. It just meant that that one went away. But it served its role for the few years that were there, that it did exist.
Outstanding. Wow. I kind of want to ask, with regards to your experiences during your homeschooling years, going back a few years, did Curtis ever come back up during your undergrad years?
It did. So Paul Bryan, who I mentioned that was directing Bravo Brass, he was at the time the registrar at the Curtis Institute of Music.
That's awesome.
That's actually how I went to play for Bravo Brass, because he conducted the brass ensemble that I played with when I was in high school. And he asked me if I had heard about Bravo Brass, and I hadn't, but he said, great, we do this. We would love to have you come play. And so I did. I played with them my freshman and sophomore year. And that was actually the first year they had opened it up to university students. Up till that point, it had only been for high school students. But they had opened it up to university students that year. So I went and I started playing. And I do remember having a conversation with him where he told me, I said something, I was talking to somebody and he overheard where I said, I would have been interested in going to Curtis, but they don't have euphonium. And he heard me and he said, very honestly, if you had come in, playing euphonium the way that you do, if you had come in and done, a half decent trombone audition, we would have brought you in as a trombone major to have you there as a euphonium player. And I'm like, well, you tell me now.
What was it like going home? Right? What was it like going home with that little, on your shoulder?
Right.
Did you tell your parents about that conversation?
I'm sure I did. And it was just kind of had a laugh about it because I think that had to have been my sophomore year. If it had been my freshman year, I would have gone for it because for those who don't know about Curtis, this is the other thing too. You can't transfer in. I do have a friend that went to another university for a year, maybe 2 years, and then won an audition at Curtis. And she went to Curtis and she essentially had to start over.
Start
Her
fresh.
4 year started over. So if I had had that conversation with Paul Bryan freshman year, then knowing myself, I probably would have auditioned and just said, it's 1 year. But that's what makes me think it must have been my sophomore year that we had that conversation because I'm thinking, okay, but I'm already halfway done. I don't want to start over.
Well, not to mention you wrote, you composed, and got commission your first commission triptych in. I mean, I mean, West Virginia probably wouldn't have happened.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I'm very aware of you never know where paths will lead.
Right.
And Drexel ended up being really, really important. So, because we are getting, we'll come back to, I guess, the end of sophomore year in that summer. But looking ahead to, I believe it was my junior year, I mentioned Paul Bryan. I know that I was very close with Dr. Mike Moss, who is the director of bands at Drexel and essentially the de facto head of the performing music at Drexel. And I remember having a conversation with him when he talked about how they were looking for somebody to direct the orchestra at Drexel. They needed somebody new to come in. It wasn't a full-time position. It was just the orchestra director.
Kind of like an adjunct.
Yeah, and it was really only a couple hours a week. So you're talking about somebody who just has the time, has the skill set, but is not looking for something full time. And I actually recommended Paul Bryan, who ended up taking the role and served for several years as the director of orchestras at Drexel.
Wow.
Yeah, and so this is the other thing too. You never know where things will lead in either direction. I don't know if he would have even been looking at that position if I hadn't, recommended him or gone to him and said, "Hey, there's this thing." And he ended up doing it and doing a great job with it for years. So these connections that you meet.
Okay, so that makes me wonder if any programming happened to make use of euphonium in orchestra.
Well, the orchestra at Drexel. So Drexel is a very unusual school. It's really a science and engineering university. So the only music major for undergrads was music industry. They did have a music therapy graduate program, but so essentially there was the band and the concert band and there was the jazz band, and then the orchestra was essentially just a string orchestra. So wasn't really programming, and especially any of the major works that are going to have euphonium. That wasn't going to happen at Drexel.
I'm glad I still asked.
Yeah,
that's cool. So, what was it like when did you talk to Dr. Moss about Paul Bryan?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, before you even pitched the position potential to him?
Oh, I'm sure I had, because again, I would leave on Monday nights. I would leave concert band rehearsal at Drexel and immediately go down half a mile to Rittenhouse Square straight into Bravo Brass rehearsals.
Oh man,
and Dr. Moss and I were very close, so I'm sure that we had the discussion at some point, talking about all of the people that were involved there. I was taking lessons at the time at Drexel with a guy named Barry McCommon, who was he was one of the assistant directors of Bravo Brass. So yeah, that Philadelphia music scene was a fairly small scene, especially in the brass world. It was a fairly small scene. The leader of the brass quintet, we had 2 faculty members in the brass quintet and 3 students. And Darren Kelly, who now is at Curtis, He was he was the head of the brass quintet. He's a trumpet player, plays a lot in the pro brass scene in Philadelphia, including with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And like I said, he's at Curtis now. Yeah, so these people that come in and out of the story in different places, sometimes at Drexel, sometimes at Curtis, sometimes at Philly Orchestra or professional gigs. It's just so yeah, I'm sure I talked to Dr. Moss about all of those people that I was working with, both educationally and performing.
Does Darren Kelly come back into the story?
Well, so
As of yet?
not necessarily. He was with me for the 4 years. He was in that brass quintet with me all 4 years that I was at Drexel, and he sat on all of my brass juries every semester and all that kind of stuff. But no, it's just interesting now to note that he has the job that Paul Bryan used to have at Curtis. So
Gotcha.
it's just a funny, yeah.
That's awesome. Now, where is Paul Bryan now? Do you know?
Still at Curtis, he just has a different position. He's no longer the registrar. I can't remember what his position is, but he's moved up. So he's still there. I just don't remember exactly what position.
That's cool. That's cool. So let's step into the summer of your sophomore year if we have a bit more time, if you want.
Yeah. So interesting. 2009 was a very, very different summer for me. It was in many ways, it was the most different summer that I had, probably up until a couple of years ago. That summer, I was on a team called the Creative Arts Service Team, acronym CAST, and it was actually a theater touring cast. So we traveled. When we were selected to be on it, it was a small group. I'm trying to remember. I think there were 9 of it. Might not have even been 9. Might have been 7. Small group of people that auditioned and were selected for this program. And what happened, the way that works is early in the summer, we went to a camp that was in New Jersey, and we spent several weeks there learning and creating our essentially 2 different theater pieces that we had. One was more of an actual play, and another was more of a I want to say pantomime. It certainly was not a dance, but it was done with music and recorded narration, but those of us on the stage never said anything. We just performed through movement, and costuming and lots of other kind of stuff. So we spent weeks learning those 2 pieces, and creating those 2 pieces and getting to know each other. And then we spent the rest of the summer traveling across essentially the Northeast United States. We went out to Ohio at one point, but then mostly Pennsylvania and up into Maine and New York, and lots of different places over the summer where we would teach in these different music and arts programs for a week at a time, or things like that, and then we would perform these pieces that we had created. So that summer was very, very different for me. My role, partly because of my education, I was on stage performing, but I was also responsible for a lot of the technology, so setting up all of our sound system and speakers. And when we were teaching at these music and arts programs, in those settings, I was typically teaching music, whereas some of the others in our team were teaching dance or theater or things like that. And also the group, we actually sang together as a group as well. So I was the pianist for that group as we traveled over the summer. So it was quite a different summer for me, but I have very, very fond memories of that summer. Really, really good friendships with those people that I spent that summer with.
How did that? Okay, so let's go back to the dance team at Drexel.
Yeah.
And the second piece that was commissioned, was that your sophomore year or junior year?
That's the part I'm not actually particularly sure. I believe that it was my sophomore year, just because that would have made the most natural sense coming off of having done one my freshman year, keeping that connection. I believe it was my sophomore year. And yeah.
Okay, so going into the the cast,
Mhm.
the creative art service team, how did that how did that influence your junior year going into your upperclassmen years?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things, and this was one of the things that I really felt was important. So another thing that people might not know about Drexel is Drexel does what are called co-ops. So they, as part of your curriculum of study, you have different, like your first summer is just your summer off. But in our program, the summer between your sophomore year and junior year, and then the summer between your junior year and senior year, is not technically just off. That summer is spent doing what's called a summer co-op. And it has to be something that is related to the degree that you're studying. Now, I was able to kind of, uh,
Kind of
I
like a
was able,
capstone project.
yeah, well, essentially, this was designed for other areas where they essentially want you working in the field even while you're studying. So, for example, my friends that were like, you know, engineering majors would spend their co-ops working for an engineering firm. So they're actually out there doing this, and then they come back and study some more, and then they go out and do it some more, and then they come back and study some more, and
Oh,
finally,
like an OJT then.
yeah,
On
yeah.
site training. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were really, I knew that I had wanted to do this creative art service team. I had wanted to do it for years. My brother had done it previously, and several friends of mine had done it in previous years before that. I knew that it was something I wanted to do. But I had to find a way to make it work for this co-op because I had to spend my summer doing this co-op. So I went to the people who were running CAST and I said to them, I want to do this, but the only way that I can do this is if my responsibilities include doing the audio technology, include teaching music, include doing all of this. And I'm going to need that in writing from you because otherwise I won't get approved for the co op. Um, and I did learn, I mean, especially from any artistic endeavor, being on the different side, doing actual stage theater production, I mean, I learned a lot, and a lot of stuff that's been very useful, in even in the strictly music settings. You start to think about audience perception in a different way. You start to think about presentation in a different way. But even on the audio technology side, I had to learn how to run our audio systems and set up our audio systems. Even though I was on stage, they had to be able to run successfully without me standing there at a soundboard. I had to know that mics were going to work and not have interference without being there at a soundboard to just hit the fader. So I learned a lot from that, and I learned a lot about sometimes we use the integrated sound systems that were in a venue that had one. So I learned a lot about being able to set up a system to another system that already exists. So I was able to learn things and do things that were specific to my music technology degree, even though from the outside looking in, it just looked like I spent all summer on stage performing.
So what about like inspecting the wires and like the connections, the all the
Yeah.
hardwire stuff, like
Yep.
and inspecting all that, like did you
Yep. Everything. The soundboard, we had it in a rolling rack. The soundboard and everything that got connected to it. So our speakers, our microphones, our everything that ever got plugged in was my responsibility. I had the ownership of that over the summer, making sure that it was packed away appropriately, making sure it was set up appropriately, everything. I that was my baby for the summer.
okay, so how soon you had to have prepped this for at the latest your spring semester of your sophomore year. Did you start like trying to get into cast and letting them know about your need for that co-op project that summer?
Yeah, I
Your
let
freshman
them
or
know.
first year and your second semester.
Yeah, I'm sure that informal conversations had happened even before that. It's a much longer story that is not relevant necessarily to this podcast, but I was actually supposed to do cast in summer of 2008, and it just kind of fell through. There was some other stuff going on, and it just didn't work out. But so they had actually already intended on having me even then. And so the informal conversations began even all the way in summer of 2008 of saying, well, let's do it next year. So as part of those conversations throughout the year, I was saying I'd love to do it next year, but the only way I can do it next year is if this is what happens.
Okay, so
Yeah.
going back into your sophomore, I mean, even the years before that, setting up with Bravo Brass, Atlantic Brass Band, the various Salvation Army ensembles, the Boys Choir, Liberty Brass Band, in every element beforehand. What was it? Did you ever consider, or did you engage in any of the AV tech stuff, like just to kind of see what's going on behind the scenes there, or?
Yeah. I in some smaller ways, sure. I mean, that was something that I kind of gravitated towards anyway, having been been interested in it. I remember with Pendel Brass, we did a recording in the summer of 2007 before, a couple weeks before I started started at Drexel. And even then I knew that's what I was going in to study. And so I actually, that weekend I was essentially the assistant audio technician. I was in the band for the recording, but I was the one that was there with our recording engineer, helping get everything set up, get the mic set up, get all and helping him pack up the end. And we actually had to do 2 different venues, so helping him do that again in the second venue. So even then, I remember being there during those production, that doing the production aspect, not just on the recording aspect. And so, yeah, always things like that where, I was learning all of the audio and the technical things, audio and visual technical things, sound and light and projection and all that. So no, I wasn't doing a whole lot of it, but it was always something that was kind of there, and something that I was always able to assist with if somebody needed help. Yeah.
Awesome. So I think we're going to go ahead and segue into the post series segment here, and give our audience a breather, an intermission per se, as we go into your upperclassmen years of
Big
Drexel.
changes, by the way, so it'll be interesting for the next one.
Okay, so then that is a good segue into perfect, awesome, big changes. I'm gonna make sure. I know you'll remember that, but I'm making my notes. So many notes. Awesome. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us on this 4th in Living History series with Dr. Joel Collier, and we look forward to having him back on very soon. Happy holidays to everyone that's watching during the holiday season. If not, it is ramping up for the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday season of 2023. Today's date is November 17th, 2023, to give you kind of a time frame and perspective of when these are actually taking place. And wow, boy howdy, we have so many great things for y'all. Catch us in the podcast segments. The links will be listed below and at internationaleuphoniumsummit.com/ Joel-Collier, and just find his beautiful face on the actual page. If that link isn't active, we'll have all the updated links, especially at farmfordreams.com eventually. And especially right here will be Dr. Joel Collier's personal channel. And wow, y'all are in for a treat. Until next time, thank you, everybody. Talk to you soon.